तू राज़े कुन फ़िक़ा है अपनी आंखों पर या हो जा, खुदी का राज़दा हो जा, खुदा का तर्जुमा हो जा। अजब नहीं कि बदल दे इसे निगाह तेरी, बुला रही है तुझे मुमकिनात की दुनिया।
Hello everyone, welcome to RawPods, conversations in creative ideas and expression hosted by Rawanee. Today's session is the second in a series of discussions that we're having on Allama Iqbal's poetry and philosophy. We will be focusing today on the concept of Khudi. We have with us a guest speaker, Zafar Anjum, who is a writer, a publisher, and a filmmaker. And more importantly, he studied Iqbal in great depth and is an author of a biography on Allama Iqbal's life. We also have with us Rafi Zuberi from Rawanee's community, who will be contributing to the discussion alongside Zafar Anjum. And on behalf of Team Rawanee, I'm Muniba Mahmood, and I will be moderating today's discussion. So thank you very much for being here today with us, Zafar. Could you tell us a little bit about your interest in Allama Iqbal?
Exactly, that was the purpose behind the book. That, I felt that a lot of people in my generation and the generations after me, the younger lot, they are not very much aware of Iqbal's work. They might have heard his name, they might have read one or two of his poems or Taranai Hindi, or in India, for example, Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindusta Hamara, those kind of things, and a few shades here and there. But, a deep understanding of his work and contribution was not there. And I myself, went through Urdu medium education till my matriculation. So we had Urdu as one of our papers, but even then, right, beyond a few poems, we did not have much exposure to Iqbal, which was very sad. And when I reached university, I was at Aligarh, then I was at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. Iqbal was mostly missing from the discourse, but at the base of it, intentionally, I just wanted to give out one message that people should read Iqbal once again, understand his contribution. And the basic message was the unity of Muslims across the world, not only in India, but across the world, which again, it was reflective of the situation of the 1920s, the early part of the 20th century. We were seeing something similar happening, right? So that was the background, that was the motivation behind this book. Iqbal, the life of a poet, philosopher, and politician.
We'll be focusing particularly on the subject of Khudi and, what Iqbal's concept of Khudi is. Conscious that not everybody who may listen to this discussion would have a very conclusive idea about what Khudi is. So can we work towards defining what Khudi is? There's also a lot of practicality towards Iqbal's influences and towards his thoughts. But even practically, Khudi has certain prescriptive elements to it.
Yeah, sure. See, there has been a lot of literature written on this topic, right? A lot of research papers and all that. I also looked up, I Googled, I had some books, I looked through them. But I would like to start with my own brush with this concept of Khudi, So again, I would go back to my childhood upbringing days, A very common shade in those days, still is probably, is, Khudi ko kar buland itna kya taqdeer se pehle, Khuda bande se khud puche, bata teri raza kya hai. I think every Urdu speaking person child or grown up would know of this couplet. So this was a very commonly recited couplet, and our parents and our elders would recite this in front of us to inspire us. And I used to wonder, what this Khudi is, as a child. Is it confidence? Is it self-development? What the hell is it? But the child's capacities are limited, right? As you grow up, you read more, your brain is more capacious, and you get more exposure. So then I came across other couplets as well, other ashar as well, which discuss Khudi. For example, the one I remember is Tera tariq amiri nahi, fakiri hai, Khudi na bech, qaribi mein naam paida kar. And then some more couplets. Maybe I would recite a few. Khudi ka naqsh man tere dil mein hai, falak jis tarah aankh ke dil mein hai. Zameen o asma, wo kursi o arsh, Khudi ki zad mein hai sari khudai. Khudi ki maut se maghrib ka अंदरूर बेनूर खुदी की मौत से मशरिक़ है मुब्तला जुज़ाम तेरे दरिया में तूफ़ान क्यों नहीं है खुदी तेरी मुसलमान क्यों नहीं है खुदी की परवरिश व तरबियत पे है मौक़ूफ़ कि मुश्त खाक में पैदा हुआ आतिश हमसोस तू राज़े कुन फ़िक़ा है अपनी आँखों पर या हो जा खुदी का राज़दा हो जा खुदा का तर्जुमा हो जा. So there are so many ashar on Khudi, that one came across. But Again, unfortunately, I would point out one trend that, if you are not, let's say, doing research in Iqbal or, studying Urdu in your, SBA and MA and all that, those subjects, the exposure is very limited, for common people, like us who are not into these subjects, for example. So I won't blame individuals, but I would say that as a social, culture, things have changed so much that, we have lost touch with these things, especially in India, I would say. I'm not sure about Pakistan. I have not been there. Probably my fellow panelists might shed more light on that. But yeah, so basically, there was never an opportunity, for somebody like me to delve deep into these concepts of Khudi beyond the superficial. That, okay, it is self-development, that is bringing out the best of qualities, etc., etc. Again, at a very superficial level. But let me, for the benefit of our listeners, your listeners, maybe share a few things I collected while trying to understand and define Khudi. So Khudi is ultimate reality or absolute ego. We call him God or Allah. This is a definition given by Iqbal himself in his Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. And basically, it emanates from his 1915 book that he published as collection of poetry, Asrar Khudi, Secrets of the Self, which was in Persian. And in that, he has explained the philosophy of Khudi or self as a term which is synonymous with the world of Ruh, as mentioned in the Quran. And Ruh is that divine spark which is present in every human being, as we know, now, including Adam al-Islam, starting from there. But one has to make a great journey of transformation to realize the divine spark, which Iqbal calls Khudi. And I would like to quote one scholar here. I was reading one of his papers, and he gives a very interesting parallel or example or similitude, to explain this concept. And he talks about, the journey of a seed to become fragrance, right? Every seed has the potential for fragrance, khushbu, within it. But to reach its fragrance, the seed must go through all the different stages and changes. First, breaking out of its shell, then breaking the ground to come into the light, developing roots at the same time, then fighting against the elements to develop leaves and flowers, and finally reaching its pinnacle by attaining the fragrance that was hidden within it. So this is, one way to understand Khudi. I mean, it's a complex concept. It can be defined in simple words also, like, let's say it's an extraordinary natural force, supernatural force, or spiritual power in our human existence. Okay, and as we study deeper into this topic, we find that by cultivating and nurturing this Khudi, human beings can attain the status of being the perfect man or Mard Kamil and become the vice regents of Allah on earth. And only by cultivating their Khudi, they can accomplish any change in society, for example. That is establishing the connection between the individual and society, in terms of Khudi. So it is a concept which has many dimensions to it. And I would like to share some elements of Khudi, which I have sort of gathered from different sources for the benefit of our discussion. So this concept of Khudi means selfhood in both individuation and wholeness, I mean individual and society. And Iqbal proposes strengthening the Khudi through the assimilation of divine attributes into a human being's personality. Another point regarding Khudi is that for Iqbal, Khudi is everything. The ideal for humanity is not the self-negation promoted by Greek classic philosophers from the Greek world, that universe, or some strands of Sufism, but self-affirmation. And some Iqbal scholars have defined Khudi, is coming again to the definition part as self-reliance, self-respect, self-confidence, self-preservation, and even self-assertion when such a thing is necessary in the interests of life, truth, justice, and duty. So these are some of the various dimensions of Khudi that can understand. And all these points are reflected in various published Iqbal that we can read in Urdu as well as in Persian. So that is from a definition point of view. We can also discuss the stages of developing Khudi, and what strengthens it or what weakens it. But maybe Rafi Saab wants to add something here.
Sure. So basically, Zafar साहब आपने काफी कॉम्प्रिहेंसिवली इसको कवर कर लिया. The only thing is कि देखिए खुद ही मेरे हिसाब से अगर आप लोगों ने फ्रॉइडियन साइकोलॉजी पढ़ी हुई है, तो खुदी इज बेसिकली जो आपकी सेल्फ है अंदर, विच इज योर ओन सेल्फ दैट ओनली यू नो अबाउट. I think that's so. There is a social self that other people see, and there is different types of selves, but this is the self that only you know about. Okay, and mostly it's about, अगर उर्दू के आसान अल्फाज में इसको कहने की कोशिश करें, तो इंसान की जो सेल्फ रिस्पेक्ट है और जो उसका अपना ईगो है और जो अपनी उसकी अपने अंदर की जो आवाज है, आई थिंक दैट्स व्हाट खुदी इज, एंड दैट्स व्हाई इन इकबाल्स वर्ल्ड खुदी is everything. If you are not self-driven, if you're not, if you're selling yourself cheaply, or if you are, very, आपका अपना self-image ही कुछ नहीं है, so then there is nothing. And you can't achieve anything, and you can't even imagine any renaissance coming. And that's why Iqbal keeps trying to remind you that what you were. सुरैया से ज़मीं पे आसमान ने हमको दे मारा, कमा दी हमने असलाफ से जो मीरास पाई थी. So basically, he's continuously reminding कि in order to give you that self-respect, that self-image, that you were a great, people. And now because you've compromised your self-image, you are now okay with your substandard existence, and that's why you are like that, and it is perpetuating. So I think in Iqbal's word, the khudi is very clearly yourself, your inner self that only you know, which in plain English could be your ego, your ghairat, your self image. जैसे आपने जिन words में दूसरे scholars के बताया, तो I think this is exactly what it is, and that's why you have to uplift your ego to start dreaming first and then start achieving those dreams. I think this is my view in a nutshell.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is, I mean, for a layperson, this is very good in terms of explanation. I think it will make sense to a lot of people. And to come back again to the points I was making, the gist of it, what I have understood is that, when God created human being, Adam alayhi salam, he infused his own, part of his divine spark. And that spark is in all human beings. And what happens that when we are born, we go through a lot of experiences, and only two things can happen, right? We can either swim away from the divine spark because of circumstances, if we lose our control on it, or we can swim towards it and become closer and closer towards it by adopting more and more godly attributes. We can come to those attributes, we can talk about them a little bit. But I think that is my understanding of Khudi, based on whatever I've read and understood so far. This coming closer to the divine spark, that is the human journey, that is the human destiny. Not everybody is able to make that transition. Like again, somebody was like, I was quoting another scholar who was talking about the seed and the fragrance, that journey of transformation. Not everybody is able to attain it, but Iqbal wants all of us to try and go for it, to make it go for it, right? One more thing, Muniba, if you may allow, I would like to give a slight context to it. Why was Iqbal talking about Khudi, at a certain point of time? And if you look at it, this is his first work of Persian, published in 1915. So fresh from his European sojourn, I would say. So I'll quote one scholar here, Mustansir Mir Sahab, who wrote this book, Iqbal, in the series in Oxford, Makers of Islamic Civilization. So he writes, and I'm quoting him, in developing his concept of Khudi, Iqbal had a specific purpose in mind. And this situates him, in his era, in his time. At the start of the 20th century, the majority of world's Muslims were politically weak, economically backward, and socially disintegrated. To Iqbal, this general decadence of the Muslims was due to the fact that they had forgotten who they were ashamed to take pride in their glorious tradition, suffered from a crisis of self-confidence, lacked self-esteem, and had despaired of building a bright future for themselves. In a word, they had allowed their khudi to waste away. Now, this connects, the next passage I'm going to read connects this, personal development of khudi to the nation's taqdeer, the nation's future and destiny. The survival of a nation, no less than that of individuals, depends on khudi. Accordingly, a nation too must guard and nurture its khudi. And it can do so by honoring its tradition, for it is history that links up a nation's past, present, and future. So this gives a nice context to why Iqbal was, coming up with this concept of khudi. And I have another view which I would like to share very briefly, Muniba, before coming back to you, is that, this was the time when European philosophers We're also talking about, like Nietzsche was talking about the Superman, some Bergson and others, they were also talking about the ultimate man and, the vital energy of Europe. And different, these kind of philosophies, on the development of ego and self. And Iqbal, coming back from Europe, right, and being a student or a scholar of philosophy, he wanted to talk about, not only he wanted to present Islam to Muslims in a very modern sense, but also wanted to present Islam and Islamic history and Muslims' past and traditions and achievements and thought processes to the West in a very modern idiom. And I think this concept of Khudi came in very handy to him, taking it from, I'm not sure about that, but scholars say that it's come from Rumi's, one of Rumi's contributions. So he's taken the word from there and developed it and made it more, germane to the Western readers as well. Remember that this book was translated by Professor Nicholson, right, in Cambridge, and then it brought great attention to Iqbal, and rightly so.
You've explained it very well. It's naturally a very vast and a profound concept. You talk about how Khudi is like a seed within everyone, and everybody has a divine spark within themselves, but they naturally need to take some steps towards developing that, and not everyone will get there. So there's a lot of, personal development that we see in there. And I think even Rafe brought up the mention of, psychological concepts. And I think Ajkal, if you look at certain buzzwords these days in the area of psychology, we talk about spirituality these days, and Iqbal did assimilate a sense of the divine into Khudi. We talk about self-affirmation. That's, something that Iqbal talked about, don't reject the life of this world, the way that perhaps some Greek philosophers and then subsequently Sufi streams of thought had promoted. Don't completely reject the life of this world in your search for spirituality, right? So there's a very pragmatic element to it. But at the same time, like you've mentioned, Khudi is something that he wanted the Muslim nation as a whole to develop, right? So it's part of a Muslim's identity. And so from my understanding of it, Khudi plays out in the various spheres of your life. So there's a personal sphere. Self-development is very much within an individual's control. And then there's Khudi as a nation, right? So what was Iqbal's concept of how a nation should assimilate itself? So maybe as a society, as a nation state, as part in a wider social context, how does Khudi play out?
It will be very interesting here to talk about individuals' Khudi and its connection with society at large. And that's the journey from Khudi to Be-Khudi, right? Asrar Khudi and Ramuz de Be-Khudi. And again, I would like to quote Dr. Mir from his book on the Makers of Islamic Civilization series. He says, while the independence of an individual human Khudi is a positive value, the isolation of one human Khudi from another is not. For such an isolation will cut off the members of a group from one another. This allows each Khudi to be a law unto itself, which potentially could lead to a state of anarchy. And that's what Nietzsche's concept is, right? Each individual unto himself. Since individuals can properly grow and develop only in interaction with one another, it is necessary that members of a society submit to a common code of conduct. Far from negating human freedom, submission to such a code channels it in wholesome ways, allowing each individual's Khudi to reach its potential within a framework of harmony. For an Islamic society, I'm coming to a point now, such a code is the Sharia, which enjoins Muslims to believe in one God, obey the Prophet, and following the Quran and the Prophet's normative practice, create a universal Muslim community that is free, egalitarian, and forward-looking. In this way, we progress from Khudi to Bi-Khudi, or selflessness. That is, from Khudi viewed in its individual capacity to Khudi viewed in its social capacity. It would be correct to say that Khudi reaches its full potential only when it becomes Bi-Khudi. So that is the connection between individual Khudi and Bi-Khudi at the societal level, right? So obviously there are a couple of stages, that one has to go through in contributing to the social level or social scale in terms of Khudi. And according to one scholar, there are 3 stages in the movement of ego towards its perfection. And that those 3 steps are like obedience of law, which, for example, could be Sharia in Islamic society's case. The second is self-control, which is the highest form of self-consciousness or egohood, and divine vicegerency. So these are the 3 steps that some scholars have identified and Iqbal's journey of Khudi.
Yeah.
So I hope that answers part of the question.
No, it does. It actually completely answers it. What exactly does an individual need to do to get to a level of Khudi that serves a nation state? Now, a thought that came into mind when you mentioned that, and that's not necessarily a question, but more a thought to leave out there, is that when you talk about an individual following the law, there is naturally an understanding that there is a legal system to be able to reach Khudi. I think that it sounds like Iqbal says that wider society also needs to organize itself for that to happen. So I think it sounds like there is a constant relationship between an individual's sense of Khudi and a wider society also organizing itself in order to, as a society and for each individual in that society to reach that state. Am I reading it correctly?
Certainly, I think. Otherwise, there would be anarchy, right? At the social level also, there has to be a framework, right? A legal framework for individuals to act within. Now, in the case of Islamic societies, like those societies which accept the Sharia laws, right, for example, that framework is codified in that sense. And it's easy for individuals to tread that path. But beside these, again, in layman words, I would say, a few things, for example, that lead to the strengthening of Khudi and also contributes to the development of Khudi in a society as a whole are, for example, love of God and Prophet Muhammad, devotion to a noble cause, self-discipline, and struggle against odds. Now, all these are, small words, but they contain deeper meaning, right? Each one of them, we can, have a separate podcast on that because each topic is so deep. But definitely, these are the few points that, connect the individual development of ego or Khudi and society's development as a whole, and both are interlinked.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Rafi, I believe you want to contribute something to this.
जी बिल्कुल. So I think I agree with what Zafar Sahib is saying. इकबाल ने कहीं पे कहा है कि अफराद के हाथों में अक़वाम की तकदीर, हर फर्द है मिल्लत के मुक़द्दर का सितारा. So basically, I think Iqbal is very clearly, वो जो individual Khudi का तस्वुर है, the individual concept of Khudi is the same one which is when inculcated in a society or in a larger group. I think the same concept is for the nations as well. In Iqbal's word, every single person, when they put, एक ऐसा माशरे की तश्कील होती है जहाँ सब लोग एक ही तरीके से सोच रहे होते हैं, उनकी वही सेल्फ रिस्पेक्ट होती है, वही स्टैंडर्ड्स होते हैं, वही लेगेसी और पेडिग्री होती है, तो फिर पूरा माशरा जो है वो उसी तरह से और पूरी कौम उसी तरह से सोचना शुरू हो जाती है. If I just quote a couple of things जो इकबाल ने, for example, in order to make the same point, कि इकबाल कह रहे हैं कि उस कौम को शमशीर की हाजत नहीं रहती, उस कौम को शमशीर की हाजत नहीं रहती हो जिसके जवानों की खुद ही सूरत फौलाद. सो द यूथ ऑफ अ नेशन, अगर उनकी खुदी जो है वो इट्स लाइक वो बिल्कुल एक फौलादी शक्ल की है और उनकी वो स्पिरिट उस तरह की है, तो फिर तलवारों की भी जरूरत नहीं पड़ती. और इसी तरह से जो अभी जफर साहब ने कोट किया, अगर खुदी ना हो एक नेशन में तो क्या होता है, उसकी एक नज्म है ज़र्ब कलीम के अंदर 3-4 शेरों की, जिसका नाम है मर्ग खुदी, which is the death of खुदी. तो खुदी की मौत से मगरिब का अंदरूं बेनूर, खुदी की मौत से मशरक़ मुब्तलाए जज़ाम, खुदी की मौत से रूह अरब है बेतब ताब, बदन इराक़ व अजम का है बे उरूक़ व इज़ाम, खुदी की मौत से हिंदी शिकस्ता बालों पर कफ़स हुआ है हलाल और आशियाना हराम, खुदी की मौत से पीरे हरम हुआ मजबूर कि बेच खाए मुसलमान का जाम-ए एहराम. So when the Khudi died, the entire nation collapses. मौलवियों ने जो है वो इस्लाम को सेल करना शुरू कर दिया. जो तायर लाहूती थे इकबाल की नज़र में, उनको कफस अच्छा लगना शुरू हो गया और आशियाने बुरे लगना शुरू हो गए. And I think this is what, as a nation, he's trying to say कि individual से वो process जरूर शुरू होता है, but when everyone is like that, तो एक माशरे की तश्कील और एक कौम की तश्कील उस तरह हो जाती है. और फिर उन कौमों का जो सेल्फ रिस्पेक्ट होती है, जो उनका ईगो होता है, जो उनका इमेज होता है इन द कमिटी ऑफ नेशंस, वो उस तरह का होता है कि उनके ऊपर कोई हाथ नहीं उठा सकता उसको.
Yeah, brilliant. That's absolutely. And just one more example, if I may add, like we mentioned self-control, like this is a very much talked about quality. Like probably a lot of self-help books, right? You will find this kind of self-discipline and self-control, these kind of qualities being discussed, right? So when Iqbal says that, from place self-control, In individuals, builds families. In countries, it builds empires. So वही है कि जब इस तरह के एक तरह के इंडिविजुअल्स मिल जाते हैं जो एक ही तरफ एक ही सिमत में वो चल रहे होते हैं, तो फिर वो नेशंस भी वो उस तरफ एक साथ चल रहे होते हैं और एक बड़ी बड़ी फिर वो सरंजाम देते हैं. तो ये बिल्कुल सही है आप जो कह रहे हैं. There is one more imagery which comes to my mind, like individual and society in terms of ego. So ego is a very this self or ego or Khudi is a very dynamic concept. It's like a river. It's like a river which is constantly flowing. So let's talk about the divine spark that we mentioned earlier in our discussion. That let's say that divine spark is symbolized by somewhere in the mountains there's a source of water, for example, right? It starts flowing from there. It's small, it's a एक लकीर सी है वो एक जोर के साथ निकलना शुरू होती है. Then it courses down the mountains, पत्थरों से टकराती है, फिर वो बड़ी बनती जाती है, आबशार बन जाती है. And then there are other sources of water like that, and they're all dynamic. They're all going through the same journey, and as they go down and down into the plains, they come together, they become rivers, and then they get merged into the big ocean, which is the ultimate divine. So that is another way of looking at Khudi, in at the individual and social level. So when Khudi is dynamic in individuals, it all comes together as a nation and builds empires, can do anything. And that's my 2 cents.
That's brilliantly explained, both of you. Thank you very much. Coming back to the point, you've explained it very well. It is a very vast concept because, there's that entire, every single person kind of needs to organize themselves, but then there's that concept of the nation as well and the interaction. You've explained that very well. So when you talk about Iqbal being an Indian nationalist and then also somebody who promoted the identity of Muslim culture, promoted Muslims creating an identity and a political force of their own, if I may, as somebody holding a number of nuanced views and loyalties, or as somebody who had his loyalties to his homeland but was pragmatic, and in the process of this personal and thought evolution he moved towards the kind of ideas that he had?
Yes, I think it was kind of an evolution, and it happens to almost all thinkers, right? People are so dynamic, especially somebody like Iqbal. So when he started off, right, the milieu he grew up in, the colonial environment that he was part of, his own journey should be an example of development of Khudi, if you may. So that way, as a patriotic poet, he started in those circles. But even if you look at his early poetry, right, there were strands of Islamic culture in there, the Mushaira culture, wherever he was reading his poetry and all that. So it went parallelly together. But then after his stay in Europe, I think whatever he saw of the world after getting out of India, I think that changed him and brought an international perspective to him. And the insights he got, and something I believe there must have been some mystic experience he might have gone through. Maybe we're not privy to it, maybe there's no record of it, but there might have been some experience of that sort that totally changed his outlook, and he became a votary of Muslim nationalism. And I think that was the need of the time as well. Somebody of his level, of his intellectual height, should have done that. I think that was essential. And today we see, hindsight, we can understand why he was doing that and why that was so relevant. So I would see it more as an evolution of Iqbal. And of course, he had a lot of strands in his poetry, but mostly I see him personally, my connect with him as, as a poet who inspires me as a Muslim and as an individual.
If I could add something here, so maybe Zafar Sahab, I personally think that the period that where Iqbal was born was a very unique period in our history, because Urdu में हम कहते हैं बड़ा मर्दम खेज period था ये, because a lot of big thinkers were born in this area, in this period, and there was so much happening, and there was so much change happening in the world order, in India itself. And then these people traveled abroad and they saw the contrast between India and UK and Germany and all these countries. And I think that's where the intellectual development was at a much higher scale. I think they were never a fish of a small pond. They saw the whole spectrum of world affairs. And then they were born in the 80s, like 18th century, end of 18th century. All of them, from Iqbal to Jinnah to Johar to Hali and all these and Sir Syed. So all these people, because they saw that transformation, and then they had their ways of actually putting it into execution. Iqbal's way was obviously mastery on the written word, on the poetry, and on the Persian and Urdu language and Hindi language, and the way he could put it together. So I think that one of the big reasons, in my opinion, was that period and the amount of change, which and then the international exposure, which shaped their. And as you rightly said, कि because वो change जिस तरह हो रही थी, इसी तरह से उनकी intellectual thought process भी change होता रहा. Philosophically, Iqbal from a Indian, let's say, an Indian nationalist. Similarly, Jinnah, Indian from an Indian nationalist, they started realizing okay, maybe a Muslim renaissance is what they should be talking about. And I think the period itself, the external environment itself, was a big contributor to that.
Absolutely, absolutely. You are very right. I mean, all the names you took. So Sayyid Ahmad Khan's influence was very, very great. And his contemporaries, like you mentioned, Hali and others, Johar brothers, right? All these people were already making a mark in this field. And so much of thought was developing and becoming manifest in writings and discussions. So, of course, that shaped his mind. And as you mentioned, his stay in Europe, in Cambridge and in Germany, that really, and the environment that he got over there, right? Or whatever he read and traveled and interacted, people he interacted with, great minds, all that fermented in his mind this idea of Muslim Renaissance. So, yeah, absolutely great time of evolution for so many other thinkers as well. But we're talking about Iqbal here, so we'll restrict ourselves to Iqbal's discussion.
Absolutely. I think you both described it very well. It's important to know where the evolution came from in order to, evolution of thought came from, what the influences were in order to properly dissect, what his philosophies were. Just coming back to the point of spirituality, and I am conscious of time, like you mentioned, each of these, there's such a vast subject between each sub-theme of Khudi and, all of the steps that an individual and a nation state need to take to attain that level of perfection. It's a very long discussion, but just to zone in a little more on the spiritual element, because, that comes out as being a very important part of this conversation on Khudi. Iqbal focuses on solitude, reflection, on developing a certain kind of vision, basira jisko kehte hai, through understanding the world, not just through the mind, but also through the heart, right? So there's a practical and the spiritual that needs to go hand in hand for Khudi, right? And then, also mentioned in his work is how this leads to certain freedom of thought, right? So it leads you to break free from the chains, whether those are of your personal thought or of, social structures. Aap ek gulami se leke azadi tak pahunchne ka ek journey hota hai. So could you shed a little bit more light on how spiritualism, reflection, and developing that vision? And this question is for both of you, Zafar and Rafi. So whoever wants to go first can take it up. Could you shed a little bit more light on this journey?
Yeah, probably if I can briefly touch upon it, Muniba. There's this couplet I would like to read here. खुदी की खिलवतों में गुम रहा मैं खुदा के सामने गोया न था मैं खुदी की खिलवतों में गुम रहा मैं खुदा के सामने गोया न था मैं. So spirituality is, you can also see it kind of a contemplation in that sense, being absorbed in oneself, being away from society, let's say, for a while. And Iqbal used to love it, right? Go into nature and contemplate. If you study the Quran, right, Allah asks us to contemplate again and again. Look at the moon, the stars, the cosmos, the ways things work on earth. All these sciences, they make us wonder. And this kind of contemplation, which largely we can put it on the bracket of spirituality, brings us closer to God, and hence God desiring and working towards achieving godly attributes and being closer to that divine spark. So I see it in that light. This is individuals struggle to come out of society, to spend some time being with oneself, being with nature, and contemplating on Allah's creation and how it works. And that will bring him closer to the divine spark in that sense.
Yes, I think that's brilliantly explained. Thank you for that. Rafi, do you want to add anything to this?
I mean, personally, I think मेरे हिसाब से اقبال نے صوفیزم کو بہت پرسنلی یعنی اپنے ایکسپیرینس کے ساتھ اس کو بہت کھول کے بیان کیا ہے، اور آئی ہیو اے فیلنگ کہ اقبال نے وہ کنیکشن اپنے ذہن میں بنایا ہے صوفیزم کا اور خودی کے ساتھ، لیکن مجھے لگتا ہے کہ وہ اتنا ڈائریکٹ کنیکشن نہیں ہے. مطلب جہاں اقبال نے اپنے خودی کو محبت سے، خودی کو جو ہے وہ ریلیجس اس کے ساتھ، اور خودی کو اپنی لیگیسی کے ساتھ جتنا ڈائریکٹلی لنک کیا ہے اقبال نے، تھوڑا سا صوفیزم کو جو ہے نا وہ اتنا ڈائریکٹلی لنک نہیں کیا خودی کے ساتھ. آئی تھنک وہ اقبال کا زیادہ انڈیویجول اپنا ذاتی جو ان کا ایک پرسوٹ تھی صوفیزم کی طرف، اس میں زیادہ مجھے نظر آتی ہے. لیکن یہ کہ obviously اقبال کی بک میں تو یہ سب چیزیں آپ کو غزل کا وہ طریقہ ہی ایسا ہے کہ ایک شعر صوفیزم پہ ہوتا ہے تو ایک جو ہے وہ خودی کے موضوع پہ ہو سکتا ہے، اس لیے آپ کو یہ اسکیٹرڈ مضامین نظر آتے ہیں. مجھے وہ ڈائریکٹ لنکیج اقبال کی خودی اور اقبال کی صوفیزم میں نظر نہیں آتی. میں ایک چھوٹی سی اقبال کی نظم ہے صوفی سے، اس کا نام ہی صوفی سے، تو وہ اگر میں آپ کو پڑھ کے سناؤں جسٹ ٹو میک مائی پوائنٹ، کہ وہ کہہ رہے ہیں کہ تیری نگاہ میں ہے معجزات کی دنیا، میری نگاہ میں ہے حادثات کی دنیا، تخیلات کی دنیا غریب ہے لیکن غریب تر ہے حیات و ممات کی دنیا، عجب نہیں کہ بدل دے اسے نگاہ تیری، بلا رہی ہے تجھے ممکنات کی دنیا. سو آئی تھنک وٹ اقبال از ٹرائنگ ٹو سے کہ جو خودی کا کانسیپٹ ہے وہ آئی تھنک وہ رینیسانس سے، ہسٹری سے اور آگے فیوچر سے زیادہ لنکڈ ہے. فائل صوفی کے بارے میں وہ سمجھتے ہیں کہ وہ اللہ تعالیٰ سے زیادہ کلوز ہوتے ہیں، اور ان کا ایک اپنی دل کی واردات جو ہے وہ زیادہ اسٹرانگ ہوتی ہے، اور اقبال بہت ایڈمائر کرتے ہیں اس کو اور بہت زیادہ اس کے بارے میں لکھا بھی ہے، لیکن اس کو خودی سے آئی تھنک اتنا ڈائریکٹ لنک نہیں کر رہے ان مائی.
جی رافع صاحب، if I may add here with your permission منیبا، یہ بالکل جہاں تک مجھے لگتا ہے اقبال کے نزدیک جو کچھ بھی ہے اگر وہ آپ کو ڈائنامزم سے دور کرتی ہے تو وہ آپ کی خودی کو کمزور کرتی ہے. تو اس طرح سے کہہ سکتے ہیں کہ صوفیزم کی جو آپ نے ذکر کیا کہ اس کو وہ تھوڑا سا بالکل ڈائریکٹلی نہیں جوڑا ہے، تو ایک طرح سے اس کا ایک چھوٹا سا ایک سائڈ کا کرٹیسزم بھی ہے، لیکن اس کو وہ پوری طرح سے ڈکرائب بھی نہیں کرتے ہیں وہ صوفیزم کو. اور ایک جگہ بڑا انٹرسٹنگ میں ابھی پڑھ رہا تھا ان کا ایک مقالہ جو ہے سیلف ان دا لائٹ آف ریلیٹیوٹی، تو اس میں انہوں نے یہ بھی لکھا ہے، جیسے ابھی ہم لوگ مراقبے کی بات کر رہے تھے رائٹ، کہ آپ نیچر کے قریب جائیں اور اپنا تھوڑا ٹائم اسپینڈ کریں اینڈ یو be closer to nature, and through nature you be closer to the creator Allah. So he says action is the highest form of contemplation. مطلب ایسا معلوم ہوتا ہے کہ اقبال صاحب جو ہے وہ پورے قوم کو جھنجھوڑنا چاہتے تھے، اور کسی بھی طرح سے وہ ان کے اندر ایک ڈائنامزم لانا چاہتے تھے. جو ایک مدنی چھا گئی تھی پورے قوم کے اوپر، نا امیدی کے بادل تھے اور ایسے حالات تھے، غربت تھی، افلاس تھا، امید نہیں تھی کیسے غلامی کی زنجیروں کو توڑا جائے گا، کیسے دوبارہ ہم ایک قوم بن کے ابھریں گے اس طرح سے کہ جیسے ہمارے ہیریٹیج میں ہے، جو ہمارے آبا و اجداد نے کیا تھا، جو تاریخ میں ہے. تو ایسا لگتا ہے کہ وہ بالکل جھنجھوڑنا چاہتے تھے اور کسی طرح سے وہ ڈائنامزم، وہ ایکشن ان کو اس میں لے کے آنا چاہتے تھے اس موڈ میں. اور ایک میں اس میں اور بھی پڑھوں جس میں کہ سائنس اور امپیریکل سائنس کا وہ ذکر کرتے ہیں. This scientific study should be only for molding the stimuli to ideal ends and purposes. تو جیسے وہ سائنس سے جوڑنے کی بات کرتے ہیں ہمارے تخیلات کو یا ہمارے نیچر کو پڑھنے کے طریقے کو، جینے کے طریقے کو. He says that it is thus only that the total self of man realizes itself as one of the greatest energies of nature. In great action alone, the self of man becomes united with God. کیونکہ گاڈ بھی ڈائنامک ہے، گاڈ تو نہیں بیٹھے ہوئے ہیں کہ دنیا بنا کے چھوڑ دیا، وہ چل رہا ہے، اس کو چلا رہے ہیں وہ. In great action alone, the self of man becomes united with God without losing its own identity and transcends the limits of space and time. Action is the highest form of contemplation. تو یہ بھی انہوں نے کہا ہے. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely, you've said it very brilliantly, and I think it's a very, very powerful message, about action and contemplation being linked. It was possibly, even a message ahead of its time as far as our Islamic schools of thought were concerned, and, the kind of focus there was. I think wo ek purposefulness or mindfulness ka concept jo hum which now psychology really promotes, I think it ultimately comes down to that, behind every action there is an intention, there is an awareness, and there is that purpose. And then if that is there behind every action, that becomes part of an individual's life, right? So I would understand from this conversation Khudi to be something that leads an individual to live a life of purpose, right? And which leads societies to work towards, again, a purposeful and a deliberate kind of future, if I may.
Absolutely, absolutely. और यही चीज मैं कहना चाह रहा था. Now there's a need, and probably you are taking a lead in that, कि इकबाल के इन कॉन्सेप्ट्स को आम लोगों तक कैसे पहुंचाया है आज की जुबान में. आज लोग जो है सेल्फ हेल्प की जुबान समझते हैं, साइकोलॉजी की जुबान समझते हैं, राइट. अभी हम लोग कॉर्पोरेट मीटिंग्स में होते हैं तो पर्पसफुलनेस की बात करते हैं लोग, राइट. तो ये वही बातें हैं. उसको सिर्फ ये है कि बजाय इसके कि सिर्फ हम इस दुनिया से या एक प्रैक्टिकल लाइफ की दुनिया के एंगल से के साथ साथ उसके साथ साथ हम उसको स्पिरिचुअल डायमेंशन से जोड़ें एज एन इंडिविजुअल. मुझे लगता है कि वो जो एक वैक्यूम है लोगों के अंदर, और शायद इसलिए ज़्यादातर लोग मोटिवेशनल स्पीकर्स की तरफ जाते हैं, या क्यों सेल्फ पब्लिशिंग इंडस्ट्री जो है एक बहुत ही चमकता हुआ सितारा है, बहुत उसकी डिमांड है. वो इसलिए है कि इंसानों के अंदर हमने इतना सेकुलराइज कर दिया है, जो डेवलप्ड सोसाइटीज़ हैं, और कि वो स्पिरिचुअलिटी से खाली हो गया है. तो एक जो उसके अंदर वैक्यूम है उसको फिल किया जा सकता है. और जो इतने अच्छे कॉन्सेप्ट्स इकबाल के हैं, जो बेहतरीन, जो डायनेमिज्म की तरह बुलाते हैं लोगों को, उसको आज की जुबान में आम लोगों तक पहुंचाया जाए तो मुझे लगता है एक बड़ी खिदमत होगी. इकबाल के लिए एक अच्छा नजराना होगा जो आप ऑलरेडी कर रही हैं.
No, absolutely. I think it's a first step. I completely agree with you as far as the need is concerned. And for that, I will thank you. You've taken the initiative of writing a book, which I believe is internationally published. And I think that does, even the way you've written the book, does an absolute service to Iqbal's message. I understand you wrote it with the intention of, removing certain misconceptions about Iqbal. I did get that idea from the book, and also develop an appreciation of how vast and nuanced his school of thought was. And I think that even ties back into this discussion of Khudi. There's multiple aspects to it, right? So there's a spiritual, there's a practical element, there's an individual and a social and even a political element to Khudi. And his thoughts were his thoughts were probably now the way Iqbal is spoken about, they're streamlined into particular classifications which don't suit him, right? Because calling Iqbal just a Muslim nationalist, a nationalist, would not do justice to, how vast and how futuristic his approach was, right? Because a man who understood various disciplines so well, psychology, philosophy, he'd studied history, and, a lot of different works. He'd studied philosophy from across different times and from across different regions before he developed his concepts. So I think, the way you portrayed it in your book is also very brilliant, and I'm very grateful for you for taking out the time today. Like you've said.
Thank you so much.